Right, hello everybody, welcome back again. I wanted to spend a bit of time today just talking about something that we've already spoken about, but I think it needs a bit more development, and it's the term ecological footprint. So as usual, the terms that I want to cover in this talk are above my head, so please return to them at the end of the video and make sure you understand the terms ecological footprint, biocapacity, ecological credit or ecological creditor, and ecological debtor. Okay. Before I go to the syllabus, let me just spend a little bit of time telling you about the background of ecological footprint. It was a term that's relatively new in environmental science. It was invented in the mid 1990s, and that was by a guy called Mathis Wackernagle, which is a great name. He was a Swiss scientist, originally an engineer, and he went to the University of Vancouver to do his PhD. And the ecological footprint idea was the result of his PhD thesis. So he worked in Vancouver with his professor, William Rees, and together, after the publication of Wackernagle's PhD, they became the world experts, well, and they invented it, on the term ecological footprint, and subsequently the two world experts on the idea of sustainability, because ecological footprint became the most accepted calculation or the most accepted term to understand sustainability, which is why we're doing it now. So he did his PhD he published it in 1994, and then I only found out recently in 1995, between 1995 and 2001, he actually came to Mexico, where he worked with the University of Anahuac, and he did his first publications on ecological footprint with the Anahuac. I'm not sure why he chose to come to Mexico. That's quite interesting. Okay, so that's the background. Possibly you think you have an understanding of ecological footprint, but it's not that straightforward, because footprint means nothing really without context. You've always got to put it into context. It's not enough to say that if you have a big ecological footprint, you are living unsustainably. It's actually possible to have a really big ecological footprint and still be living sustainably. So just be aware of these little misunderstandings that you can have with this term. This is the syllabus, and again, I've said this before, I don't think this is the greatest definition of ecological footprint. I think I'll try to give you a better one, and I'll try and give it some context, like I said before. But I'll just read out what the IB says ecological footprint is. So word for word, it says, an ecological footprint, or an EF, is the area of land and water required to sustainably provide all resources at the rate at which they're being consumed by a given population. And if the ecological footprint is greater than the area available to that population, it's an indication of unsustainability. That's quite a mouthful and not a particularly good definition in my view. Under application of skills, it's very straightforward. It just says we need to link the idea of ecological footprint calculation to sustainability, which is the basis of those two terms, ecological creditor and ecological debtor. Okay. Let me try to give you my definition. So I've said here, an ecological footprint is the hypothetical area of land needed by an individual, group, or society to fulfill all its resource needs and to assimilate all of its waste. I think that's a shorter and better definition of ecological footprint. First of all, it makes it more clear that an ecological footprint is not an actual amount of land. It's a hypothetical or imaginary amount of land that's needed. So let me give you a few ideas of what those measurements would include. So to measure your ecological footprint, you would measure the amount of land physically you actually use. So, for example, how big the plot of land is where you live, how big your demand is for natural capital, how big your demand is for energy in general, and how much waste you produce. Your waste, by the way, is often measured in another imaginary term, which is a carbon dioxide equivalent. So not all of the waste, an awful lot of the waste you produce is in the form of carbon dioxide, but not all of it. So you can turn the amount of waste you actually produced into an imaginary or hypothetical amount of carbon dioxide equivalents. And you can turn those carbon dioxide equivalents into an imaginary amount of land, which contributes to your ecological footprint. Okay. Now, I hope that made sense. It'll probably make a bit more sense when I do some calculations in a second. But an ecological footprint is this hypothetical amount of land that you require for your lifestyle. It's measured in a unit called a global hectare. And a hectare is more or less the amount of land that's needed for a professional 11-a-side football pitch. That's a hectare. Okay, now biocapacity, it's a similar idea, but from a different point of view. Your ecological footprint is how much land you hypothetically require, usually in a year, by the way, measured over a year. The biocapacity is the hypothetical amount of land that's actually available to you to provide all those needs. Okay, so the biocapacity would include how much land is physically available, for example, inside the country where you live per person. It would be an measurement of the amount of natural capital that's actually available to you, again, usually in your country. And it's the availability of land in that place to absorb all of the waste that you produce. The ecological footprint is usually measured per person, or we'd say per capita, and so is the biocapacity. It's usually an average measured per person or per capita. Okay, so let me give you an example. Let me get my pen. It's difficult to get up-to-date data all the time, even from the Global Footprint Network. But I got recently some data from 2016 from a few countries. So the first country I got data from was for Canada. And in 2016, according to the information I got hold of, Canada had a ecological footprint of, let me get this right, 7.01 global hectares per capita, per person. Okay, that was on average, the ecological footprint of the average person in Canada for 2016. The biocapacity in Canada in 2016 per person was very big, actually, 14.92 global hectares per capita. And that's because Canada is a huge country with a small population, with a lot of natural capital available. So therefore, even though the average person in Canada had a huge footprint, the biocapacity was also very big. So therefore, Canada is actually an ecological creditor. It's using less footprint than is actually available for it. Hope that made sense. All right, another country we could look at would be the US, 2016 again. Look at my notes. The US had a ecological footprint, again per person, per capita, of 8.00 global hectares per capita. So higher than the average Canadian. Big footprint, actually. But it only had a biocapacity of, let me see, 3.89 global hectares per capita. So therefore, the US is an ecological debtor. The US is not living sustainably, or the average person in the US is not living sustainably. Okay, hope that made sense. Some other data. In 2016 again, the world ecological footprint on average was 2.75 global hectares per person, per capita. And the world biocapacity, again per person, was only 1.63 global hectares per capita. So therefore, the average person on the planet today is living beyond their means, which means as a society, as a whole planet, we are living unsustainably. Okay, hope that made sense. So just a couple of other things before I finish this. First of all, this is a little graphic that I stole from the Global Footprint Network, which I hope I don't get into trouble for. You can see that the red countries, therefore, are ecological debtors. Countries that are living beyond the biocapacity measured as ecological footprint per capita. A lot of Northern Hemisphere countries. Not all MEDCs, by the way. A lot of rich countries. Some LEDCs, including Mexico, India, China, Egypt, Uganda. A lot of those countries have footprints higher than the biocapacity. And then Canada, we spoke about, is a ecological creditor. Russia, interesting. Finland, Brazil. Obviously, that's a result of the huge amount of natural capital that's available in Brazil, Argentina, and Australia. The average Australian has a really, really big footprint, but because it's such a small population density with such a huge amount of natural capital available, Australia is also an ecological creditor. Okay, I won't dwell on that. You can come back to those. Well, you can actually go to the website and look at that data for yourself. And finally, just a couple more things. I looked for the top 10 ranked ecological footprints. I'm afraid the best data I could get hold of at the time I'm recording this was 2012, so this is a bit out of date. So the per capita, or the biggest per capita footprint in the world in 2012 was actually Luxembourg, which was huge, about twice that of the average Canadian. Luxembourg is a tiny European country, imports everything, very, very little natural capital, and a huge population density. I think they use huge amounts of fossil fuels as well in Luxembourg. Aruba, Qatar, Australia, as I said before, is an ecological creditor, but it has a huge footprint. Canada's there as well. UK is in the top 10. Trinidad and Tobago. All right, I won't go through those. I'll let you look at that data in your own time. Then finally, just to summarise all of this, a large footprint is caused by a big reliance on fossil fuels, large use of technology, lot of importation, use of fossil fuels to produce a large amount of carbon dioxide waste, or a lot of pollution in general, a lot of waste in general, large amounts of food consumption, and specifically meat. Meat is a very environmentally unfriendly, or red meat especially, very environmentally unfriendly food in terms of the amount of water that's used. The amount of food that's produced to produce a kilogram of beef is huge. And we talked about before the methane that cows produce as well. You could also include that in your ecological footprint. And getting rid of the waste that cows produce as well. You can do a lot of things to reduce your own footprint. You can reduce your resource consumption. You can recycle. You can improve the efficiency of which you use all your resources. Reduce the amount of pollution you produce. Maybe increase the amount of technology we become dependent on. Move towards, obviously, renewable resources. And I've said a bit of a cheat is the exportation of waste. So a country potentially can reduce its ecological footprint by not using its own land to absorb its waste, but exporting that land somewhere else. Obviously, that's not solving any problems at all. All right, we could obviously as well go into the social issues here, which I'm sure we will do in the class. We could talk about the idea of whether it's right for MEDCs to demand that LEDCs do not have access to the same kind of ecological footprints we have, for example. if you're an ecocentric, you might argue that it's what we need to do is accept a lower standard of living and decrease our dependence on natural capital in order to decrease our footprint. If you're technocentric, you could say, well, there's no need for us to decrease our standard of living. We can just depend on technology to find solutions to decrease our dependency on natural capital and find ways for the planet to absorb our waste. There's a lot of very interesting directions that an understanding of ecological footprint could go in, but I will stop there. But before I go again, just a reminder, please make sure that you're happy with the term ecological footprint, biocapacity, and you can understand how you can combine those two terms to find out whether a country, a person, a society is an ecological creditor or an ecological debtor. Okay, again, I've gone on far too long. I hope that made sense. Take care of yourselves and your family, and I will speak to you at some point this week.